Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
the understanding of Russia, which is broadly as Russia as a great power that has its own special path, that has a mission, and that needs a strong state, and a different path to that of the West.
I think when you look at these other industries, what you find is that there's a lot of pain built up in different parts of the Russian economy. Some of it's only going to be felt over a longer period of time.
Baltic ways.
There were the countries that when the war started, they were willing to be, those voices of moral conscience.
the continent.
I think that this conflict today proves that we are able to go past grievances and that we are able to look into the future, into the common future together.
Report in short.
This is the real Achilles heel of Putin's mobilization.
And of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction.
These two countries are interacting militarily or have been interacting in several different conflicts. And in some cases, they're on the same side, and in some cases, they're not.
New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Report in Short.
Welcome to Report in Short, the podcast where we bring you the very latest in scholarship from the FPRI Eurasia program. I'm your host, Aaron Schwartzbaum. Time is of the essence here, so let's dive in. Today we're talking Nagorno-Karabakh and a report called A Frozen Conflict Boils Over. Joining me are its authors Walter Rick Landsgraf and Narek Seferian. Their biographies and a link to the report itself are in the description, and a quick note that the opinions presented are those of the authors only. I hope you enjoy. This is Report in Short. Rick and Narek, welcome to Report in Short. Great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Great to be here. Great to be here, Aaron. Thanks.
So let's just have you quickly introduce yourselves in brief. We'll start with Rick and then move over to Narek.
Hi, I'm Rick Landgraf. I'm a active duty U.S. Army officer and a fellow in the Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
And Narek?
My name is Narek Seferian. I completed my doctoral studies at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs in 2023. Right now, I'm pursuing some research and writing projects while giving that old job hunt a go.
Oh, fun times, especially in academia. So we wish you the best of luck. Let's start. There's a very long and frankly very painful history with a lot of the events we're going to talk about today. And we don't have time for the full narrative going back to the Soviet Union, if not even before that. But I want to bring listeners up to speed, at least with recent events. So, Rick, if you could tell me about the Second Karabakh War, the more recent one, and what's happened since. We'll take it from there.
The Second Karabakh War happened in the fall of 2020, from the end of September until about the second week of November. It was a short, limited interstate war, resulted in an Azerbaijani victory, and this essentially reversed the gains of the First Karabakh War, which was in 1988 to 1994. The big takeaway of the Second War is that Azerbaijani forces now controlled wide swaths of territory that previously, over the last 25 years, had been under Armenian control. And Russia mediated the ceasefire to the Second War, and thereafter had stationed a peacekeeping presence within the territory under Nagorno-Karabakh's control.
And then more recently, I want to say in fall 2023, there was a continuation, yes?
Yes, after the Second War in 2020, the period after that is really kind of still some war, still some peace is kind of how we phrase it in our report. There's some incursions by the Azerbaijani side, two military operations conducted by Azerbaijani military, and this kind of simmering levels of violence leading up to the latest assault in September of 2023, which delivered a death knell to Nagorno-Karabakh as a de facto independent state.
And if I recall correctly, basically everyone living there, at least the Armenians, then fled, correct?
The outcome of this latest episode of violence resulted in the expulsion of essentially the entire population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Estimates are at least 100,000 Armenians.
That's a lot of people, certainly. So we're going to talk about the implications of that going forward. And let's talk with your conclusions and implications. We'll turn over to Nareg here. You talk about the implications of the September 2023 war, breaking them into a few categories. So can you walk through those categories you two came up with?
Sure. The big one is indeed the rather significant humanitarian crisis. 100,000 people having to find their way, find a place for themselves in Armenia. Armenia is anyway a country of 3 million, not a very wealthy, right, and large economy. So it's been a real challenge for the Armenian government. And there has been some support from the West, from the United States, from Europe. But on the whole, this issue of housing, healthcare, education, that remains probably on top of the agenda. So we highlight that in our report, but we also touch upon a couple of conceptual and broader issues to think about. Like, for example, we have seen the use of force by the Azerbaijani government in a way that had been precluded in negotiations, in agreements. Now, this is an ongoing dispute for many decades. You can point your fingers in many directions, but this assault was really quite unexpected and in a scale which was very, very disturbing. And this kind of trying to resolve a dispute through force is not a very encouraging sign. On the global scale, when it comes to, for example, precedents for other conflicts, high on our minds is Taiwan. It's how the way the Chinese government talks about Taiwan is very, very similar to the way the Azerbaijani government would speak about Karabakh. So that's something that's been a highlight of our report. And another thing that we talk about is how we're seeing a shift in regional and global security dynamics. So we have a broader context, like with the war in Ukraine, with what's been going on in Syria, and of course in the Middle East more generally. So these are some of the things we touch upon in the conclusion. Yeah.
One other point I wanted to ask you about is a rather interesting observation you made about how identity for Azerbaijanis and Armenians, they're kind of these mirror images, especially as it relates to Karabakh. Could you delve into that a little bit, share more?
Sure, and it is indeed an important component of this dispute, unlike when you have other disputes where it's a question of access to resources or, I don't know, to a coastline or some other sort of legal matter that comes up between states. In the case of Karabakh, you have what social scientists would call imaginations or like perceptions of national identity, readings of history, narratives of what makes a nation a nation. And for the Azerbaijanis, Karabakh is an essential component of all of that. And similarly for the Armenians, the way the Armenian and Azerbaijani national identities have developed over the past, let's say, century and a half, the way they have become politicized, it happened around the same time in the same context, in the same sort of socio-cultural political milieu. So they have a lot of overlap. The Armenian identity story is a little bit broader, and it also has a kind of tension with Turkey more specifically. But for the Azerbaijanis, the Armenians have been the other. And so this turns into a very sort of deeply essentialized conflict, not unlike Israel-Palestine, actually, in a way that the two sides really cannot see beyond a zero-sum either-or outcome.
Yeah, makes sense. Let's turn back to Rick. I want to start with a quick editorial note. I sometimes see on Twitter and discussions, Armenia has palled around with Iran. And I always find that accusation interesting because if you look at a map of the region, I think it puts some of the geopolitical considerations into perspective. And speaking of geopolitical considerations, you talk about some of the things that the United States can do or can't do to mitigate future conflict or to be involved. Where do you see Washington is able to actually have influence locally?
Yeah, Aaron, I think there's really two things the United States can focus on moving forward here, and we highlight these in the report. I think one of them is mitigating the risk of follow-on conflict and follow-on escalation, and doing that through supporting and enabling international monitoring mechanism along the shared border. The second one is focusing on the humanitarian situation and focusing on integrating the people who have been displaced by the violence into Armenian society. This second one can be done through, for example, a supplemental humanitarian aid package, nowhere near the scale as something offering, something like Ukraine, but something a bit smaller. In both of these measures, the United States can and should work through its European partners, European Union, but also Turkey, Iran, as you mentioned, other regional players can play a part in this. Now, that being said, context matters here. The United States is entering into an election cycle, election year, and I think we remain pessimistic that there will be much attention, at least from Washington, on this conflict. Now, I will say on the European side, I think especially today, the European Parliament met today to discuss de escalation and monitoring measures that can be taken. So I think Washington really needs to focus on working through Brussels in carrying out these measures to prevent further escalation.
All right, let's turn back to you for our final topic. And Rick, you can please chime in if you have anything to add here. But one of the things you mentioned today and in the paper is this norm that existed, maybe still exists, hope it still exists in the world against the use of force, that force was not used because force is not used. It's not acceptable. It's against the quote unquote rules. And we've seen a fraying of that norm. It no longer has the same force, so to speak, as it used to. So you mentioned in your paper some of the ongoing risks of a direct, full-on interstate war. Tell me about that and how you think things may play out. Are you feeling optimistic, pessimistic?
It's not looking good, Aaron. I'm very sorry to say. Rick characterized the Karabakh War as an interstate war. It's probably more accurate to say that it was a military escalation of a dispute. But what we might see is a real interstate war between Azerbaijan and Armenia proper. Azerbaijani discourse, even before 2020, framed a lot of Armenia as historical Azerbaijani territory, beyond Karabakh. And since 2020, that rhetoric has been notched up by the very, very top leadership of the country. There has long been a demand of an unmitigated land access between Azerbaijan proper and its exclave of Nakhichevan, which is cut off from mainland Azerbaijan through Armenia, I mean. So there is a prospect of either some sovereign passageway, some extraterritorial arrangement in favor of Baku, or, as the leadership says of Azerbaijan, they might just cut through Armenia itself. So this is a very real concern. In the past, Armenian leaders would downplay it by saying, President Aliyev is simply stoking up his domestic support. But it has become a serious concern. And so in this case as well, Western actors, besides having a more direct role in humanitarian issues, they could have a much more direct role in diplomacy and boots on the ground in a way that might, we hope, although we don't have too much to look forward to for the reasons Rick presented, but we hope that there could be at least some hindering of such plans.
Last clarifying point, and then we're going to be out of time, but wouldn't Russia be obligated by treaty to intervene should such a scenario, unfortunately, come to pass?
Indeed, that is the case. And that has been a major point of contention between Yerevan and Moscow, because there have been such issues already. There have been incursions by Azerbaijan into fully recognized Armenian territory. No disputes there, but there has been lackluster response from up north.
Well, on that optimistic note, thank you both for joining Report in Short. If you enjoyed the topic today, please click on the link in the description and read the paper. Thank you, listener, for joining, and if you thought what you heard was interesting, stop by the link in the description and read the report itself. We'll catch you next time on Report in Short.